Number 7. The aftermath, when happily ever after gets complicated. Ever wonder what happened after medieval nobility said, "I do"? Shocked by how young some brides were. Medieval marriages were nothing like our modern love stories, and the aftermath might surprise you even more than the wedding itself. Once the elaborate ceremonies concluded and the feasting ended, the real marriage began. For noble couples in medieval times, this meant entering a partnership that was more about property and politics than personal happiness. The bride would typically move to her husband's estate or castle, sometimes miles away from her childhood home and everything familiar. Imagine being as young as 12 or 14 years old, suddenly responsible for running a large household in a strange place. The primary duty for a noble wife was clear: produce heirs, preferably male ones, medical knowledge being what it was. Childbirth proved extremely dangerous. Many noblewomen died in childbirth, with some families experiencing multiple maternal deaths. One shocking example is Elizabeth Woodville, who survived to give birth to 10 children, an unusual accomplishment for the time. Not all were so fortunate, like Cecily Neville, who lost several children in infancy despite her wealthy circumstances. Day-to-day life for a noble wife involved managing the household, which was essentially a small business operation. She would oversee servants, food supplies, household accounts, and sometimes manage estates when husbands were away fighting wars or attending court. Far from being merely decorative, these women were essentially CEOs of domestic enterprises. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, not only managed vast properties, but also essentially ruled England while her son Richard the Lionheart was off crusading. Not all marriages remained stable, despite the Church's prohibition against divorce. Some couples lived separately after producing the required heir and spare. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II famously deteriorated to the point where he imprisoned her for 16 years. Others maintained cordial partnerships while pursuing romantic interests elsewhere. Some found genuine companionship, like Margaret Beaufort and her third husband Thomas Stanley, who seemed to develop mutual respect. Affairs were common in noble marriages, though women faced far harsher consequences than men if discovered. A woman suspected of adultery could lose her children, property, freedom, and sometimes even her life. Meanwhile, noblemen openly kept mistresses with minimal social penalty. The double standard existed even at the highest levels. King Edward IV's many affairs were considered normal, while his wife was expected to remain faithful. The aftermath of these arranged marriages shaped medieval politics in profound ways. Alliances formed through marriage could deteriorate when the couple failed to produce children or when one spouse died young. New marriages would then be arranged, creating fresh alliances and enemies with each generation. The fate of entire kingdoms sometimes hung on these matrimonial arrangements. Number 6. The wedding festivities, when a marriage was actually a political summit. Have you ever spent a year's salary on a single party? Can you imagine your wedding being a matter of national security? Medieval noble weddings weren't just celebrations, they were elaborate political events where the guest list and seating arrangements could prevent wars or start them. The wedding celebration, for a high-ranking noble couple, typically lasted several days and sometimes stretched to a week or more. The expense was staggering by any standard. When Margaret of Anjou married King Henry VI in 1445, the celebrations allegedly cost more than the annual royal revenue of several smaller kingdoms. This wasn't just extravagance. It was a deliberate display of power and wealth. Food at these events defied imagination. Feasts featured elaborate subtleties, essentially edible art pieces shaped like castles, ships, or mythical beasts. For the 1429 wedding feast, when Philip the Good of Burgundy married Isabella of Portugal, records show a banquet with 48 different courses. Exotic dishes like peacock, served with feathers reattached after cooking, and dolphin were status symbols, regardless of taste. Spices imported at enormous expense from Asia were used liberally to demonstrate wealth. The ceremony itself combined religious elements with practical political considerations. While a priest performed the marriage, the exchange of vows often took place at the church door before the couple entered for Mass, ensuring the public nature of the consent. Witnesses were crucial, particularly for high-ranking marriages that affected inheritance and political alliances. For royal weddings, the entire court would typically attend, along with foreign diplomats whose presence acknowledged the legitimacy of the union. Gift-giving rituals at noble weddings reveal much about medieval power dynamics. Guests brought extravagant presents, often strategically chosen to remind the couple of political obligations. The bride's appearance reflected her family status. Margaret Tudor wore a gown so heavy with gold thread and jewels when she married James IV of Scotland that she reportedly needed assistance to walk. Meanwhile, her new husband donated his wealth by providing tournaments and pageants for entertainment. Music, dancing, and pageantry continued for days. Professional entertainers, minstrels, jugglers, and actors performed between feast courses. Tournaments allowed knights to display martial skill, while pageants often told allegorical stories flattering to both families. When Catherine of Valois married Henry V in 1420, pageants depicted the joining of French and English royal symbols, visually reinforcing the political union their bodies would later consummate. The wedding night itself was a bizarrely public affair for royalty and high nobility. The bedding ceremony involved guests escorting the couple to their chamber, sometimes undressing them and witnessing them enter the bed together. While actual consummation occurred after guests departed, proof was sometimes required, particularly for royal unions, where legitimacy of heirs was paramount. The sheets might be inspected the next morning, and the couple's physical appearance assessed by attendants. Number 5. The marriage contract. When love was a footnote in the fine print. Did you know medieval marriage contracts sometimes ran hundreds of pages? Ever heard of a 12-year-old heiress being purchased like property? The marriage contract negotiations between noble families make modern prenups look like casual agreements written on cocktail napkins. These contracts, typically drawn up by each family's legal representatives, covered everything from property transfers to succession rights. The financial aspects were paramount. For the marriage of Catherine Swynford to John of Gaunt in the 14th century, their contract specified exactly which lands she would receive as dower property given by the groom's family to support her if widowed, versus dowry, property brought by the bride to the marriage. These financial arrangements could take months to negotiate, particularly for high-ranking nobles with extensive holdings. The bride's dowry represented a significant investment by her family. For aristocratic marriages, this typically included land, money, jewels, and possibly political advantages like trading rights or military alliances. When Catherine of Aragon married Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1501, her dowry included 200,000 crowns, an astronomical sum that became a major diplomatic issue after Arthur died and negotiations began for her to marry his brother Henry VIII. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, paid only half before Arthur's death, leading to years of financial disputes. The groom's family, meanwhile, was expected to provide the bride with dower lands that would support her if her husband died before her. This widow's portion typically amounted to 1/3 of the husband's estate, though actual amounts varied widely. For Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Edward IV, her dower rights were extraordinarily generous, reflecting the unusual circumstance of a king marrying a widowed Englishwoman rather than a foreign princess. Beyond money, marriage contracts specified succession rights in exhaustive detail. Would children from previous marriages inherit? What happened if there were no male heirs? These provisions could fundamentally alter the succession of entire kingdoms. The marriage contract between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon created the legal foundation for uniting Spain, transforming European politics for centuries. Age specifications were surprisingly fluid by modern standards. While church law theoretically required minimum ages of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, contracts often arranged marriages for children much younger, with consummation delayed until they reached appropriate age. The contract for Margaret Beaufort's first marriage was negotiated when she was just 5 years old. She was married at 12 and gave birth to the future Henry VII when she was 13, an experience that physically damaged her so severely she never had another child. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities, contracts often included detailed provisions about the bride's physical condition. Inspections by midwives might confirm a noble bride's virginity before marriage. Contracts sometimes included clauses allowing for rejection if undisclosed physical defects were discovered. When Anne of Cleves married Henry VIII, sight unseen through diplomatic negotiations, her physical appearance became grounds for the marriage's annulment, though the actual reason was likely Henry's inability to consummate the marriage. Language barriers complicated these negotiations. When English nobles arranged marriages with continental families, contracts required translation and cultural interpretation. The 1396 marriage contract for Richard II of England and Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old daughter of Charles VI of France, was written in both Latin and French, with separate copies kept by each royal court to prevent later disputes over interpretation. Number 4. The courtship, when getting to know you, happened post-engagement. Have you ever met someone after agreeing to marry them? Would you let your parents choose your spouse based on property holdings? Medieval noble courtship flipped modern dating completely upside down, with couples often meeting for the first time after their families had already finalized the agreement. For noble families, courtship was primarily conducted between parents and involved extensive research into potential matches. Family connections, land holdings, and political alliances were meticulously investigated. Genealogical records were scrutinized to ensure no prohibited degree of relation existed between the potential couple. The Church prohibited marriage between cousins to the 4th degree, though dispensations could be purchased for the right price. When Edward I sought a second wife in the 13th century, his representatives investigated several French noblewomen, creating detailed reports on their appearance, health, temperament, and family connections before he selected Margaret of France. Physical meetings between the prospective bride and groom were rare before negotiations reached advanced stages. Instead, portraits might be exchanged, though these were notoriously unreliable. Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne of Cleves famously pleased Henry VIII enough to proceed with marriage negotiations, but upon meeting her, Henry reportedly found her appearance disappointing, calling her his Flanders maid. Most nobles had no such luxury of portraits and relied entirely on family descriptions. Proxy courtship was common for high-ranking nobles, particularly when international marriages were arranged. A representative might visit the prospective bride's court, bearing gifts and assessing her suitability. When Eleanor of Castile was being considered as a bride for the future Edward I of England, his father sent trusted courtiers to Spain to report on her appearance, education, and temperament. These representatives often communicated through elaborate coded language about physical attributes that might affect fertility. Letters between families negotiating marriages reveal fascinating insights into medieval priorities. Physical appearance was indeed considered particularly for brides, but often in terms of health and presumed fertility rather than beauty by modern standards. Strong hips, clear skin, and good teeth were particularly valued. Male attributes focused on strength, intelligence, and temperament. When the Earl of Northumberland investigated a potential bride for his son in 1452, his representative's letter noted approvingly that she appeared well-complexioned and likely to bear healthy offspring. Romantic attraction was considered a potential bonus, but certainly not a requirement. In fact, developing too strong an attachment before marriage was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Medical authorities warned that excessive passion could unbalance the humors, leading to physical and mental illness. A moderate affection was considered ideal. When Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville after allegedly falling deeply in love with her, contemporaries viewed this passion-based decision as reckless and politically unsound. Once negotiations reached advanced stages, chaperoned meetings might be arranged. These carefully staged encounters allowed families to observe the potential couple's interaction while preventing any inappropriate behavior. When Catherine of Aragon first met Arthur, Prince of Wales, they had practiced conversations in Latin, the only language they both spoke, with responses carefully rehearsed to present themselves favorably. Their actual conversation was reportedly stiff and awkward, despite months of preparation. For those rare couples who did meet before marriage arrangements were finalized, the interaction was heavily structured around demonstrating appropriate noble virtues rather than exploring personal compatibility. A prospective bride might display her needlework skills or musical accomplishments, while a groom might showcase horsemanship or knowledge of literature. These displays were less about romantic connection than proving one's value as a noble spouse capable of fulfilling expected roles. Number 3. The matchmaking process. When parents became medieval, Tinder. Ever considered having your marriage prospects researched by professional matchmakers? Would you trust your parents to swipe right on your future spouse? For medieval nobility, finding the right match was a sophisticated process that combined political strategy, financial analysis, and careful consideration of bloodlines. Professional matchmakers played crucial roles in identifying potential matches for noble children. These weren't romantic intermediaries, but shrewd negotiators with extensive knowledge of noble genealogies, property holdings, and political connections. They operated across Europe, maintaining detailed records of eligible nobles and their assets. In 15th century Florence, the Medici family employed dedicated agents who tracked potential marriage prospects throughout Italian city-states, compiling detailed reports on dowry, expectations, family alliances, and potential conflicts. Distance posed no barrier to these arrangements. European nobility functioned as an international marriage market, with families willingly sending children hundreds of miles for advantageous matches. When Philippa of Hainaut was selected as bride for the future Edward III of England, she traveled from what is now Belgium to England, never to return home. She was approximately 14 years old when she left everything familiar behind. These international marriages created complex webs of family connections that shaped medieval politics in profound ways. Timing these matches required careful calculation. Families balanced competing priorities, arranging matches early enough to secure advantages, but recognizing that circumstances could change dramatically before children reached marriageable age. Infant betrothals occasionally occurred for particularly high-stakes alliances. Margaret Beaufort was just 1 year old when her wardship and marriage rights were purchased by Suffolk for his son. Such early arrangements often included escape clauses if better opportunities arose before consummation. Church restrictions technically limited marriage options, prohibiting unions between relatives within 4 degrees of consanguinity. approximately third cousins. However, wealthy families regularly purchased dispensations from Rome to overcome these restrictions. The Habsburgs became notorious for their intermarriage practices, with dispensations allowing increasingly close family marriages that eventually resulted in famous genetic complications. For the right price, the Church proved remarkably flexible on these supposedly sacred prohibitions. For noble daughters, physical appearance and presumed fertility significantly influenced matchmaking considerations. Families sometimes delayed finalizing arrangements until girls showed signs of puberty, confirming their reproductive potential. Medical examinations, assessing a prospective bride's health and likely fertility, were not uncommon. Records from the Gonzaga family of Mantua show they employed physicians to examine potential brides for their sons, looking for signs of good reproductive health like wide hips and clear complexion. Intelligence and education in prospective brides generated mixed reactions. Some families valued educated women who could manage estates effectively during husbands' absences. Others worried that too much learning might make a wife troublesome or independent-minded. When Thomas More educated his daughters to an unusual degree in the early Renaissance, contemporaries expressed surprise that he sought such learned wives for his children. The ideal noble wife balanced competence with appropriate deference to male authority. Political considerations often overshadowed all others in high-ranking matches. The marriage of Margaret Tudor to James IV of Scotland in 1503 was explicitly designed to reduce border conflicts between England and Scotland. Her brother Henry VIII reportedly remarked that if the marriage failed to produce heirs, England might eventually inherit Scotland. Ironically, this is precisely what happened when Margaret's great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England a century later. Number 2. The betrothal ceremony, when getting engaged, was legally binding. Did you know a medieval betrothal was almost as binding as marriage itself? Would you risk excommunication for breaking an engagement? The betrothal ceremony for medieval nobles was a legally complex event that created obligations nearly as serious as marriage, and sometimes occurred when the participants were still in the cradle. Formal betrothals required specific language and rituals to be legally binding. The couple, or their representatives for very young nobles, would recite precise phrases indicating consent to the future marriage. These words were so important that they were typically spoken in both Latin and the vernacular to ensure their validity. For Margaret of Anjou's betrothal to Henry VI, the ceremony was conducted in 3 languages, Latin, French, and English, to ensure it would be recognized throughout their respective domains. Physical symbols played crucial roles in these ceremonies. The exchange of gifts represented the binding nature of the commitment. Rings were common, though not universal, as in modern engagements. Other significant gifts included jeweled brooches, elaborately bound prayer books, or land deeds. When Eleanor of Castile was betrothed to the future Edward I, she received lands in Gascony as part of the betrothal gifts, property that would remain hers even if the marriage somehow failed to occur. The ceremony typically involved witnesses from both families and sometimes community representatives. These witnesses would later testify to the validity of the betrothal if disputes arose. For high nobility, betrothals often occurred in public settings with multiple witnesses from different factions to prevent later claims of coercion or irregularity. The 1219 betrothal of Joan of England to Alexander II of Scotland was witnessed by representatives from multiple noble houses, the church, and both royal courts. Church involvement in noble betrothals increased throughout the medieval period. By the 13th century, priests commonly officiated betrothal ceremonies for the nobility, though their presence wasn't strictly required for validity. The Church's growing control over marriage helps standardize these practices across Europe while adding spiritual weight to the contractual obligations. When Isabella of Valois was betrothed to Richard II of England in 1396, the Archbishop of Canterbury presided, though she was only 6 years old. Breaking a formal betrothal required serious cause and often ecclesiastical permission. Valid reasons included discovery of previously unknown consanguinity, family relationship, evidence of pre-existing contracts with others, or certain physical conditions that might prevent consummation. Political reasons were not technically valid grounds for breaking betrothals, though powerful families often found ways around this restriction. When Louis XII of France wanted to break his daughter Claude's betrothal to Charles V in favor of a French match, he secured papal permission by claiming the original agreement had been made under duress. Proxy betrothals were common for international noble marriages. Representatives would stand in for absent parties, sometimes traveling great distances with legal authorization to speak binding words on behalf of their principals. In particularly elaborate cases, proxy marriages might even follow proxy betrothals, with consummation postponed until the couple physically met. When Catherine of Aragon was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the Spanish ambassador acted as her proxy in the London ceremony while she remained in Spain. The age of consent for betrothals was remarkably young by modern standards. While church law eventually established minimum ages for marriage consent, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, betrothals could be arranged much earlier. These early arrangements, called sponsalia de pure surete, indicated intent to marry once appropriate age was reached. More binding betrothals, sponsalia de presenti, could occur once children reached 7 years old, the age at which the Church believed children could reasonably consent. When Margaret Beaufort was betrothed at age 9, canon lawyers carefully documented her verbal consent to ensure the arrangement's validity. Number 1. The initial family negotiations. When children became diplomatic currency. How much would you sell your child's marriage rights for? Could you imagine your parents negotiating your future spouse when you were still learning to walk? For medieval nobility, children were valuable assets in a complex game of alliance building that began virtually from birth. These negotiations often started remarkably early in a child's life. Noble parents assessed potential matches shortly after birth, sometimes even before, evaluating which alliances would most benefit their family interests. When Eleanor of Castile gave birth to her daughter Joan in 1272, her husband Edward I was already corresponding with potential in-laws, despite the infant being barely a month old. For particularly desirable matches, informal discussions might begin even during pregnancy, with messages exchanged about potential unions contingent on the child's sex. The initial approach typically came through trusted intermediaries rather than direct family contact. These representatives would discreetly assess interest before formal negotiations began, allowing both sides to decline without public loss of face. Records from the Percy family show they employed both household chaplains and trusted merchants as early intermediaries, leveraging the natural travel of these individuals to make connections appear coincidental rather than calculated. Geographic considerations significantly influenced these preliminary discussions. Neighboring lands with boundary disputes might be united through strategic marriages, resolving generations of conflict. When the Scrope and Neville families had contested borderlands in Yorkshire during the 14th century, they eventually negotiated a marriage between their children that included land transfers, satisfying both sides. Similarly, nobles with scattered holdings might seek marriages that created geographic corridors connecting their properties, facilitating easier management and defense. Financial assessments dominated early negotiations. family representatives would discreetly investigate potential matches, economic situations, current holdings, expected inheritances, existing debts, and ongoing legal disputes that might affect property. The financial research conducted before Margaret Beaufort's first marriage uncovered her substantial inheritance rights, making her one of England's most valuable marriage prospects, despite being only a child. Similarly, William Marshall rose from relatively modest origins to become one of England's most powerful earls through his strategic marriage to Isabel de Clare, whose vast inheritance had been carefully investigated before the match was proposed. Health and fertility concerns featured prominently in preliminary discussions, particularly for female marriage prospects. Family representatives might inquire about hereditary conditions, previous childhood illnesses, or female relatives' childbearing history. When Elizabeth of York was being considered as a bride for the future Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, the first Habsburg representatives specifically investigated her mother's childbearing history. Elizabeth Woodville had successfully delivered 10 children, as an indicator of Elizabeth's likely fertility. Political alignments required careful consideration during these initial stages. Families needed to evaluate not just current allegiances, but possible future positions as political landscapes shifted. During the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, marriage negotiations became especially complex as families attempted to position themselves advantageously while minimizing risk if power shifted suddenly. The Stanley family proved particularly adept at this balancing act, arranging marriages that connected them to multiple factions without fully committing to any single side. Religious considerations became increasingly important in later medieval negotiations, particularly after the Reformation created sharp divisions within European nobility. Families needed to determine whether potential matches shared their religious orientation, and if not, whether conversion was possible or necessary. When Protestant Elizabeth I of England was negotiating potential matches with Catholic European princes, religious differences repeatedly derailed discussions despite apparent political advantages. The mother's role in these negotiations varied considerably depending on family dynamics. Widowed mothers who served as guardians for their children often played central roles in marriage negotiations. Margaret Beaufort, after being widowed young, became a formidable negotiator for advantageous marriages within her family network. Even in families with living fathers, mothers frequently conducted preliminary discussions with other noble women, using female networks to gather information and test possibilities before formal male-dominated negotiations began. What would you do if your 7-year-old came home engaged? How would modern dating apps compare to the complex algorithm medieval parents used to calculate the perfect marriage match for their toddlers?